Thank you all for coming. I know I'm sure it's very late in your day. I'm told I can't move past the screen here, so if I'm not reaching that side of the room over there, it's nothing personal. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, good. I have a pretty loud voice. If you can't hear me, let me know. I also have a tendency to talk pretty fast, so if that's happening, just kind of raise your hand and slow me down. Based on my conversation, I prepared some slides and some information that we go through, but I also would like to do it relatively informally. I see this opportunity for me and my organization to share some of our experiences, but mostly for you to hear from me and to hear about our experiences and offer some questions and some thoughts and for me to do some learning as well. So don't feel a need to wait to the end of all these slides. If you have a question, raise your hand or speak up. I think we have about an hour and a half and we'll get through it all. Again, pretty informal. If you have questions along the way, let me know. Before I go forward, though, I do want to thank Vivek in particular, Mr. Larry Diamond and Stanford, and the Liberation Tech program. My organization, NDI, has benefited a great deal from the relationship with the Liberation Tech program. It's really helped us think through a lot of our programming from a different perspective, from the sort of the Washington insider perspective that we often fall into. And because of that, I think we have better strategies for our programs and are better able to engage our partners on the ground in different countries. And as importantly, I think we're better able to engage governments and donors and other people who are doing democracy promotion work with new ideas and sort of fresh evaluative ideas of the types of work that we're all doing, and in particular the kinds of outcomes that we're all seeking. So we want to thank you for that opportunity, and thank you for having me here today. Vivek briefly mentioned NDI, and I just want to start with that. And by way of agenda, I want to talk a little bit about my organization and a little bit about my team within that, citizen participation and what that means. And then move on to the study that Vivek mentioned. You know, why did we do a study? How did we do a study? And then on to some of the, what we would maybe call some of the higher level or more interesting findings. And I'm going to pause there at different times and offer some thoughts and examples to get away from sort of the just theoretical examples down to program specifics. If you'd like to dive in, let me know. And then on to a few thoughts and ideas about what that means as we move forward. And then we'll have time at the end for questions, answers, and comments as well, depending on how long that takes to get through. But before I get started, are there any questions? Okay. So, just talking briefly about NDI, Vivek mentioned we're a large organization. We are, but we're a Washington-based, nonpartisan, nonprofit, not-for-profit organization that has been doing democracy assistance work for about 35 years. We've done it over that time in about 130 countries, and we're currently in approximately 85 different countries doing democracy assistance work. And we do it in a few main core areas of work. We work towards having the integrity of elections, so free and fair elections. We work to help political parties have pluralism and competition, be democratic within and reflect the values of citizens and connect with citizens. We work to help make the institutions of government more responsible and more effective for citizens. We also work towards women's inclusion and marginalized populations to make sure that some of the marginalized voices in societies, particularly through democratic transitions, are having an opportunity to have those voices expressed. And then finally, my team, as I mentioned, is citizen participation. And I wanted to pause on that for a moment and to explain what it is. In my work, you know, Vivek mentioned I come from an activist background in the United States. And then I had to sort of translate that experience to doing it internationally. And most of my colleagues doing international work who aren't working with parties, who aren't working in government, they call themselves civil society specialists. So essentially that means they often work with non-governmental organizations, NGOs, maybe CSOs as we call them. We have all these good acronyms, civil society groups. But they work to develop the capacity of these third sector institutes to engage in politics and to engage and to have their, really engage on issues, I would say more, engage on services. Over time, NDI came to the reasonable, I think, conclusion that capacitating organizations was a means to an end, and the end, for us at least, was making sure that these groups were representative of people's interests. And reflecting on my own background in America, I worked a lot on healthcare reform, I worked a lot on environmental reform, I did community organizing on garbage burning facilities, then I went into labor politics. And so all these groups had constituencies, they had members, that they represented or ostensibly represented in the political process. And there was an expectation that they would help those voices be heard. Oftentimes we don't see that so much in countries that are transitioning to democracy. We might see sort of professional NGO staff who say they have a voice for citizens, but there's no real evidence they do speak for those people, and those voices are coming in. There's no process by which you can really understand how they're aggregating their concerns and putting them in. All of which is probably an overblown way of saying, for us, it's about making sure citizens have their voices heard in politics, and if working with civil society groups and NGOs is the way to get there, that's great. But we know from our experience that having citizens engaged in political transformations and democratization has positive outcomes not just for democracy, but for socioeconomic development. So that's why we're citizen participation. So what does citizen participation have to do with technology? Let's cut to the chase on this. So I want to talk just a little about the context, and it's, here being in, right next to Silicon Valley, you see it more than I. But for the past probably 3 to 5 years, our work has really been flavored by this exuberance for technology as a transformative force for public life generally, and then on international level for democratization. Certainly after the Arab Spring, there's been there's a lot of news about how Twitter, or even now in Hong Kong, there are various different tools that are being used. Oftentimes, especially early on, the news was, I think, more flavored that it was because of these technologies that new democratic transformations were taking place. And we were under increasing pressure from our donor community, from other practitioners, and even from our own partners, because we typically work with local groups, to get technology into the program and get it there now. And for example, and this is all for public consumption, but all amongst friends. In a lot of Arab Spring countries, we get phone calls or emails or urgent missives from our donors to say, we need to have an app for youth in this North African country now because there's an election coming up and youth voices aren't being heard. And if youth voices aren't being heard in the election, bad things will happen. Okay, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Certainly youth voices might need to be heard, but was technology the right pathway to having youth voices heard in politics or not? To our liking, at least my team's, that question hadn't really been answered. So we continued to see that over the years, there was more and more pressure for technological improvements or technological innovation in our programs mandated by our donors, but there wasn't a real lot of knowledge about what that all meant. What were the democratic outcomes? Was democracy further served because people could tweet, or there was a special hashtag, or there was a special app for youth inclusion in a particular country? Did that establish democratic norms, make participation more likely? We really didn't know. And that's not to say that we were asleep, because I think most people didn't know. This has all been happening so quickly. So we were fortunate enough to apply for a grant to the National Endowment for Democracy and say we'd really like to look at some of our own programs over the past few years, where we said in our own proposals we're going to use information and communication technology to enhance citizens' voice in democratization. And we want to see what happened. So that's the context, that's the background. Here's what we did. NDI has a lot of programs, as I mentioned. How's that for technical term? And all over the world. So my team and we have an ICT team as well, a technology team in Washington. We did a review of all the programs, of many hundreds, where we had said specifically, we will use ICT to enhance citizen engagement in politics. We found 56 of those programs in a 2-year period, a previous 2-year period, and this is going back now about 18 months. And so we went through an iterative process of saying, well, of all of those, which ones kind of stand out more? Which ones were large enough so they scaled up? Which ones do we think, sufficient funding and sufficient time to show an impact if there could be? Which ones did NDI implement instead of hiring a vendor? So which ones do we really think we know more about and sort of have the time frame to take a look at? And we identified about 12 different programs around the world to take a look at, and several of them we did case studies. Others we did more desktop review and vignette work. So the places in which we did case studies this is Burma on the far left, something called the Burma Partnership and the Burma Election Tracker. In the case of Mexico in the middle, the Security and Justice Coalition on 3 border states, where we worked with civil society groups and injected technology before the presidential elections of about 18 months ago around security and justice issues. Excuse me. Oh, and then I did it backwards. And then in Uganda, we had a couple different programs. One is called Uganda Speak, and it's a platform that enables constituents in select areas to communicate directly with their members of parliament. And another one was called Uganda Watch, and it was a coalition of groups put together to sort of crowdsource information around the elections to try and build a database of activists over time. Because you are all probably engaged more in social science than I ever will be. I'm just a practitioner. But so we kind of knew what we were looking for. And I have this debate a lot, this conversation a lot with academics who want to do randomized control trials and don't. And there's a whole debate on that within our industry. But we tend to think we know what works to some degree. And we wanted to go out and look to see if technology impacted that, right? And I'll tell you the framework we use for that. But the method of gathering information, we did structured key informant interviews in each area with the people involved in the program, the people we perceived to be impacted by the program, and partner groups that implemented the program. And then we did these case studies, which if you want the information, Vivek can get us in our book, but there's something called most significant outcome evaluative method. So it's like doing focus groups with the people who implemented the program to understand what they think happened and why. It's a qualitative information gathering process. So we gathered all this information, right? Way too much information for those of you who've done that kind of field work, you know what it is. But then we still needed a framework to analyze it, right? So we're not just making subjective evaluations about it worked, it didn't work, people say it was good, it wasn't good. And for us, that looks like this. And this is why I spent a little bit of time on citizen participation at NDI. What we believe to be true and think is proven by experience and information and data over time is that citizen participation requires three elements to contribute effectively towards democratization. Strong and effective citizen voice, meaningful political spaces, and some amount of government accountability and responsiveness. And why I have this yellow triangle at the middle is it's where these things meet, at least for us, we do political and democratic development. That's where it happens, right? That's where politics happens. And a lot of programs that I personally work on, sometimes my organizations, NDI and others have run, you may have really strong advocacy campaigns or really strong commentary on service delivery or other things, but they're not really getting into political conversations and political space. And potentially they're not really getting a government response for those things. So you end up with a strong voice, but no change in politics. Similarly, in many places, particularly on elections, we see space opens up very much. And there's a lot of freedom of speech, there's freedom of assembly, things we sort of call first-line freedoms. But if you actually get to the more contentious sort of socioeconomic issues, there's not space for those things. So what you see is there's space at certain times, but it closes. There's not really a strong citizen voice. And similarly, not a government response. So for us, our political and democratic development happens with our programs when we seek that middle ground, getting citizens into political spaces in an effective way where they can engage government in some way and expect a response. And that whole bit is to say, so for the programs that use technology, how did they do with that? So how did they, in fact, and I'm just going to break this down a little bit more. So, unfortunately, sometimes this is what I do to try and really to bring a degree of specificity to our work and our theories so that we can write and design programs, incredibly evaluate them, and implement them with our partners. So if I'm talking about citizen voice, there's a number of elements to that I'm going to look at. Do citizens have access to information? Do they aggregate their voices? Are there credible voices in that process? Do they have a relative amount of strength? And do citizens even know what it means to be a citizen, right? These are all components of that. And so to what extent is technology hitting that at all? Oops. Similarly with political space. It's not just one thing, and it's not even just these things. But for our programs, it's the space that exists being occupied. Are there relationships being built with other actors? Can citizens and citizen groups access it? And then one of the things I think is most overlooked, and I think often overlooked when we talk about technology, is there only communication happening there, or is there some meaningful negotiation, some compromise, something happening in that political space that matters for citizens so they'll come back? Oftentimes the answer is no. They're expressing their voice, they're not getting any positive feedback. Next time, so what they learn is participation doesn't matter. So are those spaces meaningful? And a lot of NDI's work is helping them identify and make meaningful use of these spaces. And then when we tend to talk about government accountability, we talk about, where can we find political will? Is there anybody within government that wants to work with us or within political parties? Do they have the capacity to actually do something? In most countries in which we work, to be honest, the answer is no. And I'll talk a little bit about this in Uganda, but to put some flavor to that, a lot of our programs and a lot of our partners in Uganda are very effective at advocating for some particular needs. If you go, however, to the Ugandan parliament and meet with an MP, you'll see that he doesn't have a computer. He's using his own personal cell phone. His assistant doesn't speak English. He may not speak English, and they might be illiterate. The chair of the committee that he's on doesn't tell him when the committee meetings are, so he can't have any input on that. And yet he's getting sort of tremendous pressure, say, on budget issues, on education in a particular district. So he really doesn't have the capacity to respond. And to what extent, again, in the light of this study, is technology taking that into consideration? And then finally, this idea of responsiveness we think is very important, and also it plays into, I think, this technology. So many of the programs that we find and strategies that we're sort of asked to implement at different times talk about building demand for government accountability, which is a good thing in my opinion. I mean, government should be accountable to people. But you don't get from no accountability to accountability without taking a number of steps along the way. And one of the most overlooked steps along the way is usually the government even begins to respond to citizen concerns. So not going from having, for instance, no budget information whatsoever to the next budget cycle having complete, open, and transparent budget information, but maybe between there are the government representatives meeting with civil society and talking to them about it, taking their concerns seriously, providing feedback, etc. So we shoot for government responsiveness before we shoot for accountability. And again, I spent time on all this because I think it's exceptionally important to understand when we're talking about technology, at least in my work in democratization and citizen inclusion. If we're going to evaluate it, we need to evaluate it in terms of something. And for us, we evaluate it in terms of what we believe to be important and what experience has shown us to be important elements to effective citizen engagement in politics. Citizen voice, political space, and government accountability. If those things matter for citizen engagement, how does technology fit into that? So let me pause on that before I get into findings. So I know that's just a whole lot, and it might have been way too academic, but let me just pause and see if there's questions on any of that or comments. Yes, sir?
The first slide, those ladies have some type of device. What type of device was that?
I will find out for you if I can. The first slide, Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. So when in South Sudan, before South Sudan had the referendum to secede from Sudan in the north, there was huge civil society programs going on to help citizens understand what the political dynamic was, and leading up to this referendum for independence, what it is they would vote for. And so with a grant from the United States Agency for National Development, we distributed these radios, which they can be powered by the sun, or they can be powered by crank, or they can be powered by battery. And don't quote me on this, but we distributed hundreds of thousands of these radios as a precursor to doing civic education and civic discussion programs on the radio in subsequent years.
Why would you not want to be quoted on such a great thing?
The number alone, just the number. Oh. Yeah, I can't remember the exact number because it's a number of years ago, but it was a very good program and very unique. And for those of you who've worked in developing contexts, there's no infrastructure for people. So to actually get a radio there, we would go into different communities, and there would be 10 or 12 or 20 people around the radio listening to our programs, and we would hire South Sudanese staff to go in and facilitate conversations about the radio shows and about the meaning of the referendum or about the meaning of political parties and other things. So it's kind of a community engagement effort. Okay, so I want to move on, if you'll allow me, to talk a little bit about some of our findings. And again, these are the findings for us on our programs. We're not making blanket statements, although it may appear that way about technology writ large, but we think there are some reasonable conclusions or extrapolations that can be made. One is this, that technology, particularly in closed political environments, is creating new spaces for voices that where there was not space before. So new political spaces are available. You know, again, North Africa, the Arab Spring, those are areas where I think you can see that spaces for engagement and dialogue that didn't exist before technology came in now do exist. And more voices are being put in those spaces. What we are finding is happening concurrently, though, is that actually making, if you think back to my pie slides, to make those citizen voices stronger and more effective and more political is a challenge that we don't think many of us are meeting. And that challenge is not about better technology or different technology. The challenge is about doing additional or different or more political development concurrent to the implementation of that technology. And so what I mean by that is if we're going to crowdsource a bunch of feedback on, say, a constitution somewhere in Africa, which people do a lot, Somalia, for instance, right? People can tweet, they can maybe get online, they can text, they can do a variety of things to express their opinions about constitutions and constitutional drafts. In and of itself, that's probably a good thing. But what does that mean politically? Where do those voices go? How are they aggregated? What, you know, where do they go into the government? Does anybody get back to people? Does it sort of matter politically that these citizens are expressing their voices in that way beyond a new opportunity to express their voice? In many cases, the answer is no. So where's the other development around that, or where are the other entry points and opportunities? And one of the things we found from our work was as increasing resources went to technology in programs, decreasing resources went to other types of development around it. And that was, you know, frankly, one of the larger conclusions that we had is if you want that kind of democratic development that we all want with these programs, we need to devote more resources to political development, not less. Technology can't be a substitute. It can augment and enhance it. In another area, I think this is very common from our program findings, and I'll use Uganda as an example and maybe our Peru program, all of which, by the way, we have this publication that this came from. This is available on iTunes and other places. We have a few hard copies. But I'm not going to get into tremendous detail here, but if you want to know more about it, these are covered in detail, and you can even look at the programs I'm talking about. There's web links, etc. But so in the case of Uganda, for instance, we have this YouSpeak program where it was technologically, it was beautiful. We selected, randomly selected members of parliament and their districts to get this tool where citizens could call, they could text, they could email, and it would come to an NDI-run office in one of, I think, 13 languages. Our staff would translate it, send the message to the MP, put it in a case management piece of software, and follow up so that the MP would get back to the constituent, right, to build some responsiveness between elected officials and their constituents. The reality is they didn't. But not only did it's not just that the MPs weren't necessarily getting back to people, citizens weren't all that interested in doing it. And that's, I think, for a variety of reasons, probably maybe beyond the scope of the time we have here. But one of the things Vivek and I were talking about earlier today is if you're looking at people who haven't participated in politics, whether they're marginalized people, from groups that are identified as marginalized, women, rural, religious or ethnic, etc., or if they're just people who haven't had power before, to tell them that they can now communicate directly with somebody, they're probably not going to do it, right? Or in the case that we found in Uganda, what they often do is in Uganda, the political dynamics are such that the patronage system is still pretty strong, and members of parliament are, to their own chagrin, expected to use their funds for things like funerals, scholarships, sort of family emergencies. So the communications we did get through the YouSpeak program were by and large these patronage requests that had been communicated by other channels anyways, directly a direct call to the cell phone. But in some cases, we found that members of parliament they saw no self-interest in responding, right? So there was no political will to get back. And I already mentioned there's a lack of capacity. Similarly, we've done a program in Peru that we looked at where we allowed people to come on and comment on legislation that was being drafted before the parliament in Peru. And it's a really nice program, technically speaking. But when you come down to it, there's no incentives really for government to want to have citizens edit or comment on draft legislation. So the incentive structure didn't really change. And again, and the number of people who have the technical capacity to really comment on legislation is not very high. So we saw that although communication increased and opportunities for information flow increased, political participation didn't really increase.
Okay, if I can quickly ask.
Yes.
So Uganda speak is the same as you speak, right? I mean,
Yes.
so I do see that there are thousands of text messages that are being exchanged on a weekly basis. I mean, several thousands. Even though the number of people who are in your system is about in the tens of thousands. Hundreds of, I mean, you have over 100,000 members if I'm correct. So even 6,000 people communicating for the YouSpeak service and so on is not a negligible thing. It's a highly sizable number. What motivates those people to be in touch with you and with the program? And do you think they're all from a similar social class?
Those are, the short answer is I'm not sure. At the time we did the study, the numbers were less. And despite the fact that one of the things we did with this program in YouSpeak was we advertised it heavily on radio, community radio in Uganda. There's something called street marketing where people walk around with signs or flyers in Uganda, which is very popular, or when the market women are out. So we did all these different kinds of marketing, and there wasn't a lot of uptake. But again, where we saw the uptake at the time was the political class who had communicated already were using a new channel to communicate with each other. It wasn't bringing new voices in. Those who were already had some degree of experience or expectation on communicating with elected or appointed leaders now had a new venue or a new tool with which to do it, but not marginalized individuals. And one of the adjustments we've tried to make in our program there because of that, and I'll get onto this theme later, is to try and work more with groups and individuals. So for instance, in Uganda, to me, I don't know why the teachers union isn't using YouSpeak to aggregate all the teachers in one district, need enough money to buy pencils or get electricity or have a door or get paid on time, which they all do in Uganda. Why aren't they sort of seeing YouSpeak as a tool for them to do advocacy work over time and aggregating? And that's where I come back to this idea. It's because that's not what they've done before, and they need some political development and advocacy work to understand that's an appropriate strategy for them. And I'm not trying to buck the question. I would have to go back and understand about who is communicating now on YouSpeak, but the numbers are still very small as compared to what expectations were. And there was initially an idea that this thing would blow up to be all of the parliament and the Ugandan parliament would take it over, and all of that has been put on hold because of the slow uptake of it. This, I think, is an important dynamic when we're talking about technology and citizen engagement with government and elected officials, especially in developing contexts. But I'm an American, and I've done a lot of work here, and I see this more and more here, but as well. And I don't think you have to look too far to see it. But so much of the use of technology that we saw in programs and we not looked was about government giving information out, right? Or maybe citizens commenting on, in Uganda again, there's a big UN program, UNICEF program on healthcare. So is the medical clinic open? Was a doctor there? Were the prescription drugs available? People can comment all the time, right? So there's all this information going back and forth. But it has this flavor of we don't like the product, right? And it doesn't have a flavor of we're going to organize, and there are different political options and choices about resource allocation and leadership. It has a dynamic of we're commenting so you can change the product if you so choose, and in most cases they don't choose. So what we find in working with citizen groups is a good example again from Uganda. There's one group out there that had a huge number of people in a small area, maybe 20,000 people getting budget information at the local level. And they would get all this budget information, right? And then they might comment back, there's not enough for education. That's it. Right? And then the next year would come out. And so all they were doing was they were consuming information about the budget, and nobody was helping them organize politically to understand that, in an ideal situation, which they didn't live in, but they should be organizing to try and impact that budget, not commenting solely as citizens on whether or not the budget was right. And I think this is, for us, one of the larger dynamics we need to try and avoid when we're talking about ICT and citizen engagement is it's not just about information and communication. That is not a substitute for political engagement and political activism. It may be necessary for it, and it may be a precursor to it, but is not a substitute for it. And this, I kind of don't like the word agency. I think it's a bit overused. But in many of the countries in which we work, I'll work with citizen groups to help them understand that citizens not only have rights, which a lot of the work we do is about rights-based work, but they have a responsibility. And to help them understand that they need to develop some sense of agency through engagement is one of the harder things to establish democratic norms. And it's extremely important when information is going back and forth, and again, through ICT use, that the groups that are facilitating and doing that are working with citizens to help them understand that that's the case. This idea is ubiquitous, in my opinion, whether it's in this country or all the countries in which we work. In Uganda, for instance, in Mexico, gosh, where have I been lately? Jordan, other places. I'll meet with any member of a political party or any member of government, and the first thing they're going to tell us is, we're so open. You can't believe how open we are. But people can they can log on a website now and they can see budget information. They can actually understand our votes are recorded for the first time, which in many countries is quite rare. Or they know if we attended Parliament or we didn't, which is also quite rare. We are so open, and they're saying implicitly, we're democratic. And then I meet with people who are very tech-oriented, and they'll say, we just put the new API in so we can scrape all the government data, and these groups are downloading it left and right, and they're putting it out there. This is one of the most open environments you're going to see. And I can tell you, I spent a lot of time in Uganda, as Vivek knows, so technologically heavy. There's, everybody's got a lab there. UNICEF is doing stuff. Everybody's doing technology stuff there. But democracy is going down, 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 right? And there's no shortage of openness. Everything's open. The government's not open, and politics is not open. So, as I put in this report, this whole idea of open data, the technologies of open data, and the politics of open government, in my opinion, they're completely blurred. And it's a conflation of terms that I think really does a disservice to democratization work. And when I talk about democratization work, maybe I said earlier, I am talking about places in which democratic norms are still being established and institutions are still being built, something somewhat different from here. There are groups here that can take advantage of open information. In most places in which we work for democratization, there are not groups that can take advantage of that and use it politically. Governments will say, it's great. You guys can see all the budget information, and yet nobody knows how the budget is made. Nobody can go to the budget subcommittee hearings. There's supposed to be field visits by the budget subcommittees into different communities when the budget is put together. Nobody knows if and when that happens. There's no expenditure information. It might be budget information, but there's no information about what was actually spent by whom when. But it's all wonderful because it's open. And obviously I get upset by that. But I think, if you're here because you're thinking about technology and you're thinking about particularly democratization, this idea that communication and information are a substitute for political engagement, I would just want you to think about that hard. And secondly, this idea that open means politically open. Again, it may be a precursor, it may be a necessary step towards open government, but open government existed long before open data did. I know, I worked on it. It meant that we could access where decisions were made and impact those decisions if we were politically organized well enough. And what I unfortunately see happening in many of the programs in which we work and others is partner organizations, so really good nonprofit groups on the ground or trade unions or other groups will say, we'll come in as Western funders and that's what they, say, great, we want to open stuff up. If we can have open budget information, it's going to transform politics in our country. And the reality is it's not unless something else is happening, right? So enough on that, but to say that this blurring between technologies and politics, I think, is very, very unfortunate, and I think is going to get worse before it gets better. Another sort of top-level theme that we saw from our program analysis was, in a lot of countries now, rather than, I'm old now, and when I used to first started going doing work overseas maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it was still about old school organizing, and that's what I did because that was my background, right? And that's how you got voices in the process. You organized youth, or you organized rural women, or you organized whoever it was because that's what was available to you to help them get in the process. But now there's this idea that if you can get technology out there, you don't need to organize them. They'll self-organize through crowdsourcing. And one example, again, I can offer from a program in Africa is that prior to a large election, an important election, and some constitutional reforms, donor community came to us and said that we really need to have an organized youth voice in this process because the demographics of most of the world, and particularly Africa, are that youth are exceptionally important to the political stability and democratization of those countries. But their solution for that was we needed to be able to get them to crowdsource their thoughts and their opinions on the process. And we came back and said, but when the election is done or the Constitution is done, that's when politics is going to happen, right? And we've seen this in where elections have occurred. Those who are better organized win, and they continue to win politically subsequent to the elections. But there has been kind of, I think this is still the case, that getting these disparate voices in will somehow equate to self-organized groups with political power and a political strategy, and that those in the receiving end of the voices will react in a way because it's in their self-interest to do so. It's just not the case. So what we saw in this particular country I'm thinking of was great crowdsourcing, tweeting, and there was a web platform people could comment, and there was just an amazing amount of great information from youth groups and sort of disparate youth groups, particularly outside the capital city. And then the election came, and the Constitution Forms came and went, and all those groups were still out there talking, but the political decisions were being made in the Capitol in rooms with people who held elected office or represented large groups already. So this idea that crowdsourcing gets you someplace in terms of organized political activity is, I think, worth of a lot of critical thinking beforehand. Often does not equal the political influence that a lot of people would like it to have. Which I think comes to this point as well. In our work, and we made all the wrong assumptions of us too. So we're not pointing fingers, just saying we thought a lot of this stuff. We were in conversations and program design of these things, and didn't have the answers we want. This was one for us as well. As I mentioned earlier, one of our main points of focus over the decades has been women's inclusion, and then probably the last 5 or 6 years, it's been about other marginalized groups, whether it's youth or rural individuals or gay, lesbians, what have you. And so we kind of drank the Kool-Aid everybody else, saying, what an easy way to reach people. The infrastructure isn't there to get out into the field, but if we can just have them engage with technology, and as I've said to Vivek before, if we can bridge the political divide by bridging the technological divide, we can take a shortcut. So the rural women in a particular country who couldn't participate, now if we have an app for them, or if they can text, or they can get online, or there's some other way that they'll somehow become politically empowered. And I would say we're not saying that's not happening, but we are saying there's not evidence that it is happening. We couldn't find it. And there's in the process of looking at our programs, they also did a very large desktop and research review. We didn't find any other people who had been researching to say these are great case studies and examples where marginalized groups, strictly through the application of technology, have become empowered politically where they were disempowered before, in the context of the kind of work we do. We just didn't see it. And what we have found in many cases is, again, that the resources are being allocated towards the technology but not towards the political engagement development of these groups, I think to their own disadvantage. All right, so more importantly perhaps, because that was the title I think of the talk, where did we really see interesting and positive things happening? One of the more interesting cases I think is in Mexico. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that we worked in 3 states in Mexico. Over a few years we worked to get community-based organizations, so kind of informal NGOs and groups that might be mothers that disappeared, or community policing groups, or small business groups that wanted their neighborhoods to be safe. We helped organize these groups in a way to start going to city councils, maybe to have some policy positions, to try and get their communities to focus on making it more safe through a couple of things. One is about policing, and one is about sort of judicial reform. And then we got some more money before the presidential and federal elections of maybe 18 months ago to bring some technology into that. And our team down there and our partners did a fantastic job. So there was a political base to build upon with these groups, but rather than sort of go in a new direction with technology, they tried to figure out how they could amplify that political organizing with technology. And so they put together this sort of multi-tiered program where they went out to candidates and asked to interview them, video interview them about what would they do to reform to make communities safer for the first time in Mexico, and they got it on tape, right? And then they got a YouTube channel. And then they decided to have community meetings where they went out and had community meetings with people to ask their positions, if candidates would come and talk or party members to come and talk. and they videotaped those and put them on. And then they got a website where people could go and type their questions to the candidates and get answers, and that's up there permanently. And then they had like online town hall meetings where people could come in and view interviews with candidates. And then they started a Twitter campaign to get people to be aware of events that were happening and the positions that different candidates had on the elections. And they built this, and then they put Facebook page. I mean, I could keep going, but you know, they've used the kind of technology, and I know we talk about this a lot in Silicon Valley area, appropriate technology, but they didn't build all these new apps, right? They used what people were using. They used YouTube, they used Facebook, they did build a little bit of an interface for people to go and comment, but they did it in the context of people's experience getting incrementally more involved and being interested on what they could do to make their community safer around a key election time. And so they went from these relatively small groups to a national platform, Security and Justice Coalition, which is now a national platform in Mexico with these 3 regional-based groups. They got an immense amount of traction politically before the election, and they're using mostly what they gained before the election to try and hold these elected officials accountable after the election. So if they said they were going to look for judicial reform, they're going to do something different with appointments, they were going to change how policing was done, they're partnered with national NGOs in Parliament to track them and do report cards that come back out electronically, as well as in hard copy, as well as at community meetings to the people that were interested. And I think it was just a great organizing, which is I always love, but it was a really good use of like limited resources and technology to slowly build out political power and pressure in a way that wasn't necessarily sexy technologically, but it really made the most difference, I thought. Another area, which again I think is a bit of the incredible grasp, the amazingly obvious, with our rapid political openings and unexpected, you know, whether it's a snap election, whether there's openings, you know, sudden changes and transition in government, citizens can use technology to communicate and organize, self-organize, at least in the short term, in ways that they never could before. But where we do see that, though, is it's much more effective in disruptive engagement than it is in long-term sort of sustained engagement. You know, whether it's in Hong Kong, whether it's Arab Spring countries, elsewhere, technology really enables people to do that in ways they could not. And for us in particular, it's been exceptionally effective in doing domestic election monitoring with different groups to report on the free and fairness of elections in different places in real time, which wasn't possible in the past. In the case, this amplification of CSOs, I mentioned in Mexico, but also in this Burma election tracker, there's a bunch of different groups NDI worked with in Burma before the changes happened in Burma called the Burma Partnership. And it was mostly run in Thailand by groups who really were expatriate groups who were really concerned about human rights violations in Burma. And we worked with them for a number of years to not just be different groups, but try to get sort of a coalition and a strong voice. And again, similar to the case in Mexico, these groups were right about the right time, and all of a sudden, who knew these changes were going to happen, right? All of a sudden, Burma decides to open up. And we helped put together this Burma election tracker. So they went from, you know, a regional group to an international group that all the media internationally went to as the expert on what was happening, both for human rights and when the elections came, on the free and fairness of the elections. And they did it through a sort of integrated web platform, which elections? Would it be 2 years ago, roughly?
April 2014.
Yes, yes, those elections.
2012, the by-election.
Yes. And in the lead up to that, what they were doing wasn't particularly high tech, but they were using thumb drives people were doing their human rights reports from service delivery organizations and bringing them out. And they were being analyzed and aggregated and reported and put up on this portal so that the world could see what was happening in Burma. And then it was activated so people were doing similar types of monitoring around the elections. And it built them into I think it amplified them into a sort of international player on Burma human rights instead of a disparate group of service delivery organizations or human rights monitoring groups that gives them a much more effective voice in the transition. And I think, again, without technology, I'm sure they would have had traction, but they wouldn't have had the kind of traction that they did. Okay, I'm going to move forward and say, again, I think some of these are relatively intuitive conclusions, and pardon some of the graphics, but we don't have a full graphics team yet, just some interns. But you know, you can just tell by our comments, or my comments, I should say, that really the aspirations for technology, I think the pendulum is swinging back a little bit. Aspirations aren't maybe so high, but I think they're still too high. The belief that technology alone can change the democratic dynamics of a situation, I think are still too high. And again, without some kind of other political development to go along with it, we're not going to achieve the results we'd like. And one of the reasons that we talk about this a lot, again, we're involved in conversations with Stanford and with the U.S. government, with the UN, with various other governments and donors and practitioners, is we think it's just really important that we all examine these issues in a way. So not that we implement our programs similarly or speak exactly from the same page, but at least we're asking some critical questions about major trends like, is technology getting us where we want to go in democratic development? I think this particular fact is true whether you're talking about technology or not, that sound strategy and program design is necessary. I can say from my experience in doing the study that I'm referring to and working in the field for the last 5 years when technology came in, a lot of it just looked like that was thrown at the wall. If we give people enough money to do a bunch of SMS work or do blast SMSs or aggregate voices on a server so later on we can email them about an important thing, that's going to be a good thing for democracy. There's just, I think, a sort of an inherent and naive belief that that was the case. And there wasn't a plausible connection between that use of technology and establishing and deepening democratic behavior in a country. And so one of the things that my team tries to do, along with many others within NDI, is make sure that when we're writing proposals that we are making those plausible connections and pushing back on our partners and our donors and others to say, if you really want these kinds of technologies in the program, and yet we all agree on the outcomes we're seeking, help us connect those dots, because we're not seeing the connection maybe as strongly as you are. And I mentioned this more than once already, but from our perspective, technology has taken away money from political development, and adequate funding really is needed more now than ever for political development around technology and increased communication and information flow, rather than less resources for political development. Just again, somewhat obvious. I mean, you're all here, I assume, because you're interested in democracy, democratization, technology. You're positioned very well. I think the world is not going to go backwards in this. So for our organization, I think it's a real challenge to stay up to speed on what works and what doesn't, versus what's shiny and new, and to have a staff in our Washington office, because we do most of our work around the world. We do have people in Washington, like myself, who are at least based there, to really understand which technologies are most appropriate for the environments in which we work, which ones aren't, and to stay abreast of that. I think that's going to be a challenge for all of us. It's going to move so quickly. So, I mentioned we have this study. If you're interested in electronic, there's EPUB versions at Lulu and iTunes. There's also PDFs on the NDI.org website. If anybody's interested, it's much easier to, I think, look through if you're interested in a particular country or a particular case study I mentioned.